nutrition, lifestyle, and PED education. This is the Elite Strength Podcast with Aaron Scarfy.
Welcome back, guys and girls, to the Elite Strength Podcast, episode number 18, I believe, here with a recurring guest, Mr. Jeffery from the UK. How are you, sir?
Not too bad, my friend. It is 7 p.m. on a Sunday, so working the weekend. I just said to Aaron, it's my third podcast today, so we've been absolutely smashing them out. But yeah. I do, I love a podcast. I don't feel like it's something that I'm getting, like this being the third one today, I'm not like, oh, I've got to do another podcast. I'm always down for the podcast, Yeah,
it kind of doesn't feel like work, right? It's kind of like, it's just having a chat.
It's just chat, really. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, it's why we run 2 a week. I got this one and another one that I do with a couple of mates. And it's literally, if you ever watch Bro Chat from, Canada with Fuad, the guys that do, and like Ian Valier and all that.
I don't, but I've been told to watch it.
You've been told, yeah. So we do the Aussie version effectively with a bit more science, considering they don't really have a very good science background, it would appear, especially when they start talking about PEDs.
The only podcast I listen to is Joe Rogan. Literally, that is the only podcast that I get a chance to listen to.
The least scientific one that you could pick.
Yeah, it's usually the ones who they have like a hormone specialist on it.
Yeah.
What is this fucking nonsense?
Yeah, exactly right. So I thought today, man, we'll have a quick chat about cutting, dieting, lipolytics and things that we can use to assist a cut for enhanced people. And I guess some of the fears and trying to kill some of the fears that people have around some of these drugs that, when we talk about them, we know that it's always, in the dosages where things can get tricky. But if we can apply a minimal effective dose, we seem to get some really nice results without really risking any sides.
Mm-hmm.
So wanting to talk about maybe things like clenbuterol, BMP, and I guess probably one that people are feared of is insulin, which is not so much a cutting drug, but one that people are always concerned about. I guess, what they are, what they do, and how we can sort of deploy them.
Yeah, I think, as you said, insulin is the most scapegoated drug of the physique development world. The most fear-mongered drug, the most misunderstood drug. The funny thing is like, if you look at how these drugs are used clinically in what particular dosing, and then if you look at how we extrapolate those dosings to the enhancement realm, insulin's one of those that we use far below the clinical deployment. But for some reason, like, we're scared shitless of it. But then we seem to be okay with like elevating androgens above and beyond even like trial data, and it's fine. There's a bit of a weird dichotomy there that doesn't make much sense. If we're talking about using insulin at like 3 to 5 units with like a rapid acting analog, or like 10 to 20 units with a basal analog, compare that to what like a type 1 diabetic is using. Like a 5-year-old girl, type 1 diabetics, like pushing those dosages up. So
yeah.
When it comes to physiological function, that kind of dosing of insulin is not going to cause any kind of deleterious effects at all. The issue with insulin purely when it comes to physiological effects, and the reason why I'm trying to separate physiological from anything else is that, the main thing that we are concerned with insulin use is hypo, right? Just like a drop in blood sugar that's going to drop so low that you die.
Yes.
So to put some context on that, for anybody with a functioning pancreas, I highly doubt you're going to be capable of that. You'd have to take a hell of a lot. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but over here, you don't get vials of insulin anymore. You don't see them anywhere. They're all pens here in the UK and Europe.
Yeah, they're the same here.
Yeah, so the pen is designed so that you can't take too much by accident, really. So there's 300 units in a pen, and I think it's 70 units you can turn the pen to for a dose.
Yeah, I think
some portion of 300. Anyway.
Yeah, it's like 40 or 50 maybe here, I think, from memory. I'd have to have a look.
It might be that here as well. So, I mean, if we're looking at something like Lantus, so the LD50 is 1,000 units. So the lethal dose 50 means the dosing that an individual could use that there's like a 50% chance it would kill half of the people that took this dose. So for 1,000 units, you'd have to not only inject more than 3 whole pens, you'd have to do it multiple times. Yeah, so like you're sitting there screwing the pen and pinning it and then getting the next one out and being like, I swear I was only meant to do 10 units, but this is like, like how does you end up in that position? It's impossible. So, this is where the reality of how dangerous insulin comes when you look at the respective dosing. And yes, you could inject 50 units of a rapid-acting insulin analog and go very hypo and, pass out or something, but you'll just liberate glucose, glucagon will kick up and all the good stuff will happen and you'll wake up and be like, shit.
Yeah, it's very, very hard to sort of kill yourself, I guess, using insulin, provided you're relatively healthy.
Yeah, there's a lot of case studies of insulin mediated attempted suicide, you could say, on PubMed that you can find. And in 99% of these cases, what happens is the individual is admitted to hospital and they're given glucose on an IV and they wake up. Yeah,
was there a nurse or something that had given...
this was in the UK.
Yeah, in the UK, yeah. Read the dosaging wrong and gave a little too much and the person still lived.
Yeah, and the case study was even funnier because like the person went home and called up and said like, I feel funny or something. It was just bizarre. Yeah, 10 mil of our rapid-acting insulin analog that's used mostly here is Nova Rapid.
Yes.
It's made by Novo Nordisk. It's the same as Humalog for anybody listening. So if in 1 mil we have 100 units, in 10 mil we have 1,000. This person's been given 1,000 units. Yeah, and I think that the thing was as well that it was injected intramuscular. I think that was the mistake as well.
Yeah, right. Quick absorption. Why not?
I think it was because they used, 10 mil is a lot. You'd have to have a lot bigger than an insulin barrel.
Yes.
I think that was the thing that they'd like mistook the dosing instructions and injected it like a vaccination.
Jesus.
Crazy stuff. But yeah, that was in the UK. Like I said.
And so I guess for those listening, just a touch on insulin. So we sort of spoke about, why you don't need to be scared of it. But I guess for those that are listening, what's its actual positive effects? Like, why do we use it, especially, wanting to grow?
Yeah, so for me, there's sort of multi-pronged, multifaceted way that you could look at this. Now, there's some pretty technical, synergistic and permissive relationships between growth hormone and insulin when it comes to like the ERK1 and 2 pathway, JAK-STAT pathways and stuff, and how we can drive local IGF-1 up, blah, blah, blah. I think before we even get to things like that, the greatest utility for me of a basal-acting insulin is for relief of beta cells and moving us further away from, I don't want to say like metabolic disease, but like the recreation of the behaviors of an individual with some kind of like metabolic disorder.
Yeah.
Overconsumption of food over multiple years and the net fatigue cost of that. This is how insulin acts as an anti-aging medicine and why it is used in anti-aging clinics now as a basal form is how we can quote unquote protect the pancreas from the activities of a bodybuilder of overfeeding.
Yes.
That's the main role there. And also in note with that, there's this really steep J-curve response. Or no, I'm going to take that back. It's not necessarily a J-curve, and more so an inverted U actually, of insulin exposure and insulin sensitivity.
Yes.
So it's like insulin if anything, is going to improve your insulin sensitivity by pulling some stress off of the pancreas at lower dosages that have been clinically defined with a basal acting insulin of somewhere around 0.1 to 0.2 units per kilo of body weight.
Yep.
Now, as we escalate up, you have an exponentially greater potential cost of insulin resistance driving from just net insulin exposure and hyperinsulinemia, which is where it starts to not become a benefit. So unlike anabolics, I feel, where like quite clearly more does more and then eventually it tails off, insulin's got a very tight inverted U response.
Yeah.
And like it's really good and then pretty rapidly it's fucking you up.
That's fair. And I guess would that be a similar premise for using rapid as well instead of basal, or as well as basal?
I feel exactly the same. And I think we've got loads of anecdote of people that have ran things like the Milos protocol and stuff. I think like having an opportunity to try super physiological nutrient partitioning is great. Super physiological glycogen super compensation, you could say, especially around a glucose intensive activity like training. I think that has great merit for a bodybuilder, but it has to be within a degree that's manageable long term. Like a chronic exposure for me with insulin is much more suited than a blast, so to speak.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, you know, those 3 to 5 unit dosings in the peri-workout window of a Nova Rapid, I think, work extremely well. But when you start getting up to the 10 unit, the 20 unit, that cost is pretty great. And the amount of overfeeding needed to support that as well is huge.
Yep, completely fair. And that's why I just thought I'd want to touch on it for those that are always deeming to be scared of insulin. It's kind of like, well, you need to have a lot to be potentially concerned.
Yeah, and that's even it. Yeah, like the effective dosages of insulin, or I should say like what I feel are the most effective dosages of insulin, are like almost not even like food timing reliant. You know, like Lantus, like 10 units of Lantus, I could do that and not eat all day. I'll be fine.
Yeah, and you'd be fine. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. I guess touching on now the actual lipolytics. So the two that I really wanted to sort of get into were clenbuterol and DNP. Those that I guess are the more feared of the lipolytics. I guess what clenbuterol is, how it works, and I guess why we shouldn't be scared of it, right?
Yeah, so I did an article on Physique Collective a while ago about cardiovascular risks of clenbuterol. I think it's fair that there's a few studies that are at least interesting when it comes to cardiovascular risk with clenbuterol use. However, in clinical practice, I think it's a bit cloudy. And you have examples like the Hatfield protocol, where these individuals are, it's either 720 or 770 micrograms per day. I'm just Googling that. Where basically it's people that have had heart failure issues that are exposed to these really high dosages of 720 micrograms a day. There you go. They're exposed to these really high dosages of clenbuterol as actually part of their heart disease. Was it disease? Whatever issue that they've had. I think it was like prior heart failure. And there's no decrease in ejection fraction or function of the heart basically with this. And this is chronic exposure of this amount as well. Very, very, very long term. And, you know, I think what people do is they take it, and because I'll mix this in with the question that you asked, how does it work? So it's a beta-2 adrenergic receptor agonist. So basically it activates, I can never say the word, like a denylate cyclase. You can probably say it better than I can. Essentially we're talking about like, which results in the smooth bronchial muscle relaxing. You have a decrease in airway obstruction, you could say, but the primary MOA when it comes to lipolysis is driving up the adrenaline within its interactions with the beta receptor inside of an adipocyte. Yes. You can imagine like the yin and yang with clenbuterol and yohimbine. So the clenbuterol like activates beta receptors and yohimbine deactivates alpha receptors. so that we have more beta cell function and blah, blah, blah. So I think people conflate the adrenaline increase and the resultant increase in resting heart rate with something to do with the heart. Which I think is fair. If you're living with a higher resting heart rate, then plausibly the end result is being driven by some kind of pathology of your cardiovascular health. But it's always important to look at the prior steps rather than the end point of the downstream signal.
Yep.
If we're just looking at resting heart rate and be like, right, we've definitely got some kind of damage to the heart, it's like we need to trace up what led to the end result.
For sure.
I think for the most part, clenbuterol in extreme dosages seems fairly safe for humans to use. And dosages that we use in bodybuilding, we're miles off of, we should be, of 720 micrograms per day. In my clients, I'll typically 80 is usually the top end. I can't think of a time, not in recent years, that I've gone above 80 microgram per day. Yep. But this is something that I prefer to use longer, lower, slower.
Yes.
So right from the get-go, for the most part, in lower dosages throughout the entirety of a fat loss phase or a prep is what I would prefer.
Yeah, no, that's completely fair. It's a lot of the time people are very worried that it's causing heart issues, whether it be the resting heart rate increase or whether they heard it from some bro in the gym that tells them not to use clenbuterol in a cut because it's bad for your heart. Have no basis for that comment.
Plenty of steroids.
Yeah. Of course, the 5 grams per week is the minimum for growth and cutting at the same time. So, guys, don't do that. It's just a joke. So I guess the other side to clenbuterol, when it does come to the worry of it affecting the heart. So we spoke about sort of its resting heart rate increase because of the adrenaline issue. I guess, are there any other sort of things that you sort of consider, not using clenbuterol for someone that is healthy?
The only other stuff that I've seen in literature was in a rodent study, clenbuterol did deplete taurine levels in rodent heart.
Yes.
Whether that translates to humans, I don't know. I think it's fairly safe just to take a bit of taurine. As PEDs, as you probably should anyway. It's a very potent antioxidant, and we should be doing everything we can to attenuate oxidative stress. So that's quite literally the only thing that I've seen with clen that's a potential consideration. I'm not a fan of the other shorter acting beta-2 adrenergic receptor agonists. I think that the sort of chronic, greater area under the curve of that activation is more important. I've seen some coaches have the salbutamol in the morning option. It's like, this is where we're going to burn the most fat when we're fasted and stuff. But the issue being is that beta-2 activation is not reliant on free fatty acid mobilization or something like that. It's not dependent on this fasted window where we perform non-glucose intensive activities and avoid food and things like this. It's a completely different mechanism that lends itself to fat oxidation. I'd much rather, like any drug, have a greater area under the curve of exposure for the same net dosing.
Yes. Yeah, I thought salbutamol for some reason was an antagonist, not an agonist, but I could be completely wrong on that one. I don't know much about salbutamol. I actually got asked as a question. I was like, I don't know.
Is salbutamol the same as albuterol, just a trade name?
I believe so, but I could be, like I said, I could be wrong and not my field. I tend to just stick with clenbuterol, ones that I know.
Yeah. I think salbutamol is the trade name of albuterol.
Yeah.
I could be wrong as well.
Yeah, I think it's used as as I say, it's used as another asthma alternative.
Inhaler.
I think it's an inhaler, right? Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Well, so I guess moving on to then, I guess, DMP, the scary one, or the most scary one that even, pro bodybuilders are sort of scared of and say not to touch and play with. I guess what it does, what is it?
DMP is chemical uncoupler. So what we're talking about there basically is, how can you even make this simple? Like protons that leak across the inside of your mitochondrial membranes, and therefore they bypass ATP synthase. So your ATP, or I should just say your energy production, is far less efficient. So basically, the energy that's normally produced from cellular respiration has to go somewhere. It has to be disposed of as heat, which is why you get very hot on DMP. And that's the basis of how DMP works, in a very simple mechanism. I did an article called like The History of DMP. I'm pretty sure it's still on Physique Collective, but the actual human data on DMP goes back very far. I think the first study I cited in that was 1906. And it was used as a weight loss medication.
Yes, you could buy it over the counter from one stage, right?
Yes, and what was happening with these prescriptions was they were basically giving the individual DMP and titrating for effect until they were losing, I'm sure it was £2 a week. And it worked great. And then when it was prescribed over the counter, people were doing what humans do, and they were taking more and more and more. And then the deaths started coming, which is, of course, the issue with having a relatively low and accessible LD50. Then the chemical was banned. I've had a bit of like a hypothesis that I think the obesity epidemic may be solved by a new generation chemical uncoupler that's much safer than DMP. Don't know what it is yet, but I have a feeling that mechanism is what's gonna. Well, actually, I'm now starting to move towards the GLP-1 agonist being that thing. But so DMP was banned because of the abuse of the drug. But I'm sure anybody listening to this understands that you can absolutely rail the shit out of any drug and have problems. The issue with DMP simply being that the LD50 is not that far away from the effective dose, depending on where you select your effective dose. Another problem with DMP may be the quality of the supply. Like that worries me. Like, let's say the worst thing, an underground lab, like dosed 5 times a drug. Like if I took 5 times my 40 microgram of Clen, like I'm gonna be fine. If I took 5 times my 200 milligram of DMP, I'm probably still going to be fine. You know, because that's only a gram. But and people have done more than that. You know, shout out Tony Hughes, whatever the fuck he is. I'm probably still going to be fine, but I might not. I might not. You know, especially if I like. But let's say I take that and then go and eat a ridiculous amount of carbohydrates. Then I'm going to be in trouble. You know?
Well, that was the old thought process, wasn't it? Take your DMP and then eat carbohydrates.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that, although the active life of DMP is very long. So unless you just never eat any food, you're going to be in an issue. But yeah, it makes sense when it comes to like ATP synthase and carbohydrate. But I mean, for me, if we're talking about drugs that are like extremely safe at their effective dosage, that's what DMP is. You're not going to, especially for effect, right? So let's say about 100 milligrams of DMP on paper roughly is around an 11% increase in your BMR, which is astronomical. You're not getting that with most of the drugs. You know, you look at something like Clen, like I wonder how much you'd have to take to get that much kick in BMR. Quite a bit. And, you know, people that have used DMP, 100 milligrams is like in the background kind of thing. You know, you don't even feel that it's there. There's not going to be side effects there. What will happen is you will look flat and like soft.
Flat and watery.
There's a really weird look that, you know, when I've got a client that's using DMP, like I can just see it on them, you know. But if you can live with that, it's I find the biggest benefit of DMP as a lipolytic is that it comes without the nervous system cost. So everything else that you're doing in a prep, like your expenditure, calorie deficit, the clenbuterol, the T3, the caffeine reliance, the nicotine reliance, the high cortisol state, the high adrenaline state, the norepinephrine state from being of low food, the poor sleep, and you're like wired. At least DMP isn't a contributor. One thing, out of all of these things. And if you can stay away from as much of that like sympathetic tone escalation as possible, ultimately you're going to be in for a better fat loss experience, I think.
Yep. So for those, I guess, listening, so sort of spoke about it, tried to simplify its pathway and, the proton leak. I guess in a simpler term, how does that equate to, I guess, fat loss?
You're simply talking about energy wastage, right? So energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It can only be transferred. Yes. Now, rather than being transferred to an adipocyte, like a fat cell, we're literally getting rid of it through heat, because the process of storage, I mean, any scientist listening to this, please, I'm sorry, because I know that I'm oversimplifying this to a pretty high degree. But for the layperson listening to this, it pretty much is that simple. It's almost like energy wasting, of the amount of food that you consume, a certain amount of that energy is going to be wasted as heat energy. So that, the energy in and out equation is going to be modulated by what your BMR is doing. And that increase in BMR is what dictates the energy into energy out part of the equation that lends itself to a greater deficit.
Yes. And I guess from there, how does it pull from fat effectively compared to what you're eating in terms of food? Like in terms of if you're eating carbohydrates and that sort of stuff, considering glycogen's, the primary energy source.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily a case of like other drugs that would mobilize free fatty acids from adipocytes or drive greater fat oxidation, which is maybe one reason why many people don't like it. It's literally just a contributor to that energy in and out equation. So it's not going to bias any kind of fat mobilization. But what's pretty clear as well, let's use the insulin carbohydrate model, for example. And what's pretty clear is that biasing drug use that lends itself to interactions at the fat cell does not mean anything when it comes to fat loss. It doesn't matter what you're doing there. You're just going to fill that fat cell back up if you're not in a deficit.
Very true.
It's literally just by the mechanism of what we mentioned. So no interactions with the fat cell. But your a consideration is absolutely, as you said, that glycogen synthesis is going to be reduced. And you're going to look pretty shit. But it's very effective and very safe in effective dosages. But I think the issue comes with escalating dose, not only in terms of side effect, but as you said, like training performance outcomes that are like on DMP, like there's metabolite accumulation net zero. So I think if you are planning to use more than 50 to 100 milligrams per day, I think you're going to put yourself in a situation where there's a pretty great cost. And the issue very often with fat loss drugs is the knock-on effect to other parts of your stack design.
Yes.
So if you're taking a very high dose of DMP, you're going to have to offset that with a higher dose of androgens to push up muscle protein synthesis or drive down muscle protein breakdown to modulate the cost of the drug that's just kicking up BMR. And then you're putting yourself in a worse position and driving fatigue even higher, because now on, two different pathways driving greater fatigue on a diet is never a good idea.
Totally fair.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think DMP has great efficacy as a fat loss drug, but again, like insulin, I feel like the inverted U is like pretty sharp.
Yeah. The ranges
it works great at lower dosages and then sucks at higher dosages.
Well, I mean, for those that are listening, I guess I've actually personally run DMP twice, no problems, quite enjoy it. It's definitely up there as a favorite with a couple of others like metformin. We won't get into that today. We might save that for another chat. I guess when it comes to stack design for, a cutting cycle, we'll say, how do we start to design that? What do we look at when we're looking at cutting stacks, I guess?
I think it would depend on the way that this phase fits into your overall periodization of your macrocycles.
Yes.
Just for a quick example, like a mini cut, right? A mini cut is literally just to potentiate more massing. And I would usually use a mini cut like somewhere in, let's say I've got a macrocycle for a client. We've got like 2 massing blocks, a mini cut, and then 2 massing blocks or something. So for me, the stack design there is irrelevant. It's just part of the net accumulation of the whole drug stack design for the end goal of growth.
Yes.
So for a cutting phase, I would distribute this out in a couple of ways. So I'd either do it post-maintenance after a macrocycle, more than likely staying on TRT/cruise dosages, because the requirements of androgens here are very low for maintaining muscle mass. On that note, the only other place that I would put it outside of a prep is right at the beginning of a macrocycle. So for example, like tomorrow, I'm starting a new phase myself. I've just done 6 weeks of maintenance. I've got this 32-week macrocycle planned out that's going to have androgen accumulation. I'm starting it with a diet, 2 4-to-1 paradigms. I'm going to accumulate 50 milligrams through that to then get to my starting dosages of massing. The other consideration being that your total androgen load will depend on the amount of musculature that you've got. 99% of people listening to this will be able to maintain their size on TRT on a cut, even like a pretty harsh one, especially if you're using things like, if you're using growth hormone that has whole body protein synthesis contributions, you're using clenbuterol that drives muscle protein synthesis through its phosphorylation of mTOR. You've got a lot of anabolism, outside of just your androgens. I highly doubt anyone's losing muscle there. But, I can think of some clients that are very, very muscular that genuinely would lose muscle if they're dieting sans escalated dosages, but the dosages would be very, very low. Now, talking about stack design, overall, the androgen load will just reflect your requirements to maintain muscle tissue on the way down. Yes. The leaner that you get, the greater those requirements will be, because the more muscle protein breakdown you will express.
Yes.
The only other consideration would be potentially using a glucocorticoid receptor agonist like trenbolone, in the sense that will provide you with some relief to potentially higher net androgen loads through activating that pathway of GR activation. 50 to 100 milligrams of trenbolone may save you 200 or 300 milligrams of total androgens.
Yes.
In that phase, highly dependent on the individual, again, whether those needs are there and whether you're escalating that far. And also weighing up the risk to reward of potential neurotoxicity that could occur there. Yep. So your base of testosterone, whatever you can typically handle as an individual works well. Some trenbolone in there if you need that GR agonist property, so 50 to 100 milligram. And then you can fill the rest with primobolan or Mastron, a steroidal SARM that's literally just there for driving more muscle protein synthesis, more protein accretion signaling, is perfect at the relevant androgen load. But I think the big point to hit home is that your androgen load is going to be significantly less. In a prep, it's a little bit different, but still, through a prep, I'm slowly escalating dosages to reflect the needs of the client, because it's even more important that we drive as little fatigue as possible. When I think about some of my guys that competed this year, like Scott, who just won the British Championships, he, we were looking at about 2/3 of the total androgen load at the end as compared to the peak growth phase.
Yes.
So there's when you shredded out your mind and you need some cosmetic benefit, there's an escalation of dosing. But it's not off-season dosing, Yeah, I was going to say there's the comparison between off-season and sort of peak growth versus peak cutting, even for a stage, goal. There's still quite a discrepancy, right, in terms of total androgens used. Yeah. I mean, you're talking about enough to inhibit muscle loss and then enough to drive cosmetic benefit. any more than that, and you are just like rinsing more fatigue. And it's something like anecdotally I've seen in competitors over the years many times when they've been too heavily drugged, so to speak, and the look is poor. You know, the look is almost sinewy, tired.
Yes.
You know, and I think anyone that's used a lot of steroids have got to that point in their cycle sometimes and been like, I don't feel very good.
Yep.
And then stack that on top of everything else that you're doing in prep.
Yeah.
You're in a situation.
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear, I guess, that side of the spectrum, in that you're not, even though we know you're titrating up in a deficit towards the show, that's still going to be nowhere near or, you know, not close to peak androgen load in a growth phase, because a lot of people think you can still grow potentially during a cut, especially leading to stage. And it's, you know, trying to help them understand that's not how it works. You're just trying to maintain as much muscle mass, but as you go through the deficit, you're going to require more androgens so you can kill off protein breakdown.
Yeah.
And it's just
if you're growing in a prep, like you're either a genetic freak, because I preface that with Leon, who is a genetic freak, who literally stayed the same weight through his whole prep, but we weren't pushing for that. I kept pulling calories down, kept moving expenditure up. You're checking the next week, weighing the same. And I'm like, at the beginning, I'm like, bro, you sticking to this. But then the physique just kept improving. And then he won his show, you know, classic physique champion. And his weight didn't change from the off season to show day. So he obviously linearly grew into the show, but he is a fucking freak. For most people, trying to grow into a show will put you in a poor position. You'll probably not end up getting peeled.
Yeah, completely fair. I was going to say, in terms of actual stack design for the stage compared to just a sort of, not a gen pop, you know, an advanced gen pop client, we'll call it. I guess, how would that differ in terms of lipolytics and, you know, maybe the design of using the lipolytics?
Honestly, I think that's going to depend on the duration of the use. So I will rather infrequently use DMP in a contest prep, maybe at the front end. The way that I tend to structure contest preps is to be very aggressive on the front end and slow it down linearly as we get closer to the show until we eventually get to maintenance from 4-ish weeks out anyway. So by that time, we'd have tapered off the lipolytics and whatnot. If you have a shorter phase, like a mini cut or, you know, like a 4-week diet, 6-week diet, whatever it may be, you can afford to be more aggressive because it's the duration of exposure that's going to lend itself to more muscle protein breakdown and the amount of body fat that you have. So you could absolutely escalate dosages higher and maybe have a little less regard for nervous system function and whatnot. But the compounds will all be the same. It's just like I'm not that interested in running DMP hard into a show because I'm just not going to know what the client actually looks like.
That's fair.
So I'd probably bias more towards clenbuterol, thyroid hormones and growth hormone. But for any other period, it's much the same, probably just the degree of which I'm using them.
Yeah, so for like a 20 to 20, I know you sort of like to prep, 20 to 30 weeks, that sort of for the longer, slower.
I'd probably say 16 to 24. But I'm a big fan of diet breaks and even moving phases around. Like I'll use someone, you know, like Dean as an example. So we had like 2 deficits and then like 2 surplus blocks. And now we're going into like 2 more. No, I think 1 more surplus block and 2 more deficit blocks. So although it's prep, it's like we're not just running a deficit because it's a push-pull when the time's right to bring in the best physique. And, you know, if you look at the situation he's in now, it kind of paints a picture of why you want to have that pretty close manipulation. Like he's way ahead of schedule, but also eating quite a lot of food and feeling very good. So it's a coast in to the show kind of thing. I wouldn't recommend like a 24-week linear deficit or something. But so this is also, you know, I had a chat with a coach at a show last week and he's saying, man, how do all of your clients get so peeled? And I said, how long do you prep you guys for? He says, 12 weeks, all of them. So, they've been dying twice as long as yours have, bro.
That's why it's simply just time.
Yeah, literally my clients have been dieting 2 times longer than yours. So give yourself time.
There was one there that you did sort of mention that actually, I guess my mistake not to touch on was thyroid hormones and, exogenous thyroid hormones, T3, T4 being, the go-to for a lot of people. I guess a lot of people are also, I guess, concerned, probably not scared, but maybe concerned about these hormones and sort of how they play a role, and does it cause issues for their natural production once they stop?
So there is a negative feedback loop within the thyroidal axes, as there is with growth hormone use and testosterone use and things like this. Growth hormone and thyroid hormones are like very acute. Like growth hormone especially, you're just going to notice normal endogenous growth hormone production the next day. You're going to be fine. Thyroid lag time being like 10 to 18 days, I think, is the average clinically defined.
Yes.
So I haven't personally, I think there's always a chance of the negative feedback inhibition being forever. But I've never, ever heard of that. And even being on thyroid replacement is extremely easy. In fact, I'm quite a fan of looking at a client's thyroid, both T4 and T3. So the deiodination rate of T4 to T3, and ensuring both are in a really nice spot. And if they're not, just exogenously placing them there and keeping them there through the prep. I very rarely use thyroid hormones to drive hyperthyroid actions.
Yes.
Very rarely. Although I wouldn't go as far to say that there's no efficacy or utility in doing so. I think plausibly we could talk about how thyroid hormones escalate muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. But if you've got something in there inhibiting that to a degree, then you could create more net muscle protein synthesis and potentially greater metabolic outcomes. So I typically like to use either a T4 monotherapy or a T3, T4 combination therapy, depending on the client's blood work, and putting them maybe at the top end of active T3 and free T4, or maybe slightly above, and literally just leaving it there just to avoid the hormonal attenuation that's involved with prep. But for anyone concerned, like there's a very, very, very unlikely that you're not going to be able to recover your own endogenous thyroid action.
Yeah. Would you do the same in a growth phase then if it's got this net positive effect on protein synthesis?
Yeah, I think it's less about protein synthesis then, just hold it in a pretty comfortable spot of thyroid action. For me, it's almost about like, what's the word I'm looking for here? Optimizing all facets of outcomes. If you've got a bodybuilder that's pretty comfortable with replacing androgens, I find that like being on TRT is like a pretty normal thing in the bodybuilding world now, but using thyroid drugs long-term is a bit like, whoa. I think people like greatly underestimate the requirements of thyroid as well. Like the average replacement dose of T4 is 1.6 micrograms per kilo of body weight per day. So like for me, I'm like 105 kilos, let's just say 160 micrograms of T4. Funnily enough, actually, I do track my blood work pretty closely. And my replacement of T3, T4 is 150 T4, 37.5 T3. And that like sounds like quite a lot. And there are coaches that say just take 12.5 microgram T3.
Yeah.
Doing nothing. It's literally not even enough to cause any kind of negative feedback. So yeah, I like just, if I have a client that's a competitive bodybuilder and I recognize that they're using drugs long-term and they're competing frequently, I usually just have that as a lifelong deployment, or at least career-long deployment, just to sit them comfortably in one spot, and so that we know what's going on.
Yes. Yeah. That makes sense. I guess, are there any other lipolytics or lipolytics that you like to use, whether it be in prep or outside of prep, that we sort of haven't covered? I think they're the main ones, like DNP, clenbuterol, even yihimbine, and people having some fears. Growth hormone? Yeah,
I like growth hormone.
Yes, you do like growth hormone.
Yeah, growth hormone is a kind of favorite of mine in that it's extremely effective at mobilizing free fatty acids and contributing to beta oxidation. With no nervous system issue like that, anything like that is a big win for me. I think, when people say like it's not that effective kind of expensive fat burner, it's like you're just using it wrong. It's extremely potent. And we know the dosing requirements very, very well. It's used in clinical data. It's got escalated dosing, so we've got predictable outcomes. We know the top line of free fatty acid mobilization dosing. It's just a very like straightforward and predictable drug for me. So I do like growth hormone, and I quite like nicotine as well.
Yes.
As a beta 2.
Go on.
As a catalyst to beta 2 adrenergic receptor activation, I think it works extremely well in synergy with growth hormone and thyroid hormones, and is a great nootropic. And it's very short acting, again, for nervous system function. I think sleep is like the thing that I'm most anally protective about on the dieting phase. And you can use nicotine pretty late and it's gone by the time you're in bed, unlike caffeine. And it's pretty potent.
With the growth hormone, I guess some of those dosages that you were mentioning that we have, the research on, I guess what would we be looking at, how much and when for, using it as a lipolytic?
So the literature that we've got on this is IV. If you translate that over, and I've done that formulation on Physique Collective, you end up with about 1.5 units per 100 kilos of body weight. So if you're at 225 pounds, is that right? Male, male or female, not gendering anyone. Social justice warriors in my DMs. You're looking at 1.5 units to really top off free fatty acid mobilization. So if you're huge, you might need 2.
Yep.
If you're a small male or female, you may require 1. Pretty easy to modulate that around. We want to do this in a fasted environment. So the presence of blood amino acids, dietary fatty acids, insulin, blood glucose, these attenuate the free fatty acid mobilizing effects of growth hormone quite catastrophically, actually, to quite a degree, which is where I think people don't think it works very well. Like if you drink essential amino acids, you're really heavily blunting that free fatty acid mobilization. And everyone is doing their cardio drinking some kind of thing, turning off a lot of these. Or the even worse thing that people are doing is taking insulin with their growth hormone to bring their blood glucose down. And that is a great misunderstanding.
And you wonder why you probably feel like crap trying to do cardio first thing in the morning, fasted with insulin in you.
Exactly. That's an absolutely crazy protocol from the past that seems to be living on somehow. Pairing up your growth hormone with non-glucose intensive activities is great. Like if you have a dog, which you probably should anyway, take your growth hormone and go for a walk for an hour. A million benefits there. You get 7,000 steps done if you walk at a good pace. Daylight exposure is good for you. Some cold exposure in the morning. I'm not trying to get homeopathic on you, but that's very good for you as well. And you're going to mobilize a hella load of fatty acids. Bring a nicotine gun with you, if you want to get crazy.
Well, I was going to say, would caffeine also assist in that? Or would it just be nicotine, do you think?
No, caffeine for sure. Yeah.
Being a bit ergogenic could help boost a few things.
Or probably more so injectable L-carnitine.
That's probably another one we didn't touch on.
Well, I think, of all the things that L-carnitine does, which is many, it's like a multi-pronged mechanism. I think its ability of increasing potential beta oxidation, couple that with free fatty acid mobilization from growth hormone, you've got this 1 + 1 = 3. L-carnitine is another one people are I didn't see anything from it. It's well, you're not supposed to see something from it. It is supposed to be permissively letting everything else work a bit better so you could maybe use less of everything else. Yeah,
completely fair. Well, I guess then not similar to carnitine, but a similar name, Cardarene, which was a very popular, drug that people were using for cutting. I guess, why wouldn't we use that?
So knows what I'm going to say. So for anybody listening, Cardarene is a PPAR modulator, specifically PPAR delta. And it works incredibly well at what it does. It was studied for metabolic disease states, and it unfortunately failed the clinical standard carcinogenicity testing, which is basically where you take these hand Winstrau rats and give them crazy dosages of drugs that, like, these rats are genetically prone to tumor growth anyways. Like, they're getting cancer, like probably drink water and get cancer. But this is the standard research testing, and it failed on that now. So the question obviously becomes as like, are you okay with that or not? Because you might be. I'm not particularly comfortable with things like that. But the obvious question is like, is there another molecule that went through the same testing that does like the same thing and passed? And the answer is yes, telmisartan, but it's not as aggressive of a PPAR modulator. But for me, that's fine. It still works very well. I think appreciably when you map out the dosings, you can get a pretty good whack. Like I use 80 milligrams of telmisartan. You see clinical dosing tends to start at 20 and titrates up to like 120. I think out of 80 milligrams, I get a pretty like noticeable PPAR kind of effect on my aerobic outcomes, which I translate to it's probably doing the rest of the stuff as well. So yeah, I would much rather pick drugs that have passed the standardized toxicity testing, you know.
Yep, completely fair. So I thought I'd touch on that actually. One that I quite like also, as you know, so thought I'd jump on that one and explain why not to use Cardarene, considering it didn't pass its testing, where a lot of people seem to not realize it's kind of a bad thing. That's it from me, my friend. I think covered quite a few things there, and hopefully the listeners do get a bit of an insight into why a lot of these drugs really aren't as scary as they're made out to be by your local gym bro. As we always finish with a question in terms of Instagram accounts you follow, the better your daily life. Are there any new ones that you have? Because I know you don't like to scroll too much.
Instagram, yeah, I don't really use Instagram too much. Let me have a look. Maybe I could shout out some of my, okay, who did I last visit? Okay, I'm going to shout out Leon Pierce. He is at _classic_ghost. Go on there to watch his posing tutorials, bodybuilders. They are very, very good. Who else have I got on here? Okay, I'm just reading through my last searches. At Emma's_outdoor_life. One of my clients, Emma Thackeray, who is an absolute legend because she let me and my wife stay in her holiday cottage over the last week. And one of my clients has just texted me, Adele is using a GLP agonist. It's the kind of stuff we talk about. Everyone else is talking about birds and football and shit.
Well, yeah.
It was on a GLP agonist. So anyway, yeah, Emma let me stay at her cottage, and they had a gym attached to the cottage, a building right next to it with Cybex Eagle pieces and nitro.
That's pretty
pieces.
cool.
Yeah, it was like being in fucking heaven, and we ate loads of Bakewell pudding and shit. So that was cool. Also, check out, girls, if you're listening, it's probably one female listening to this, at Compact, KOMPAK, women, for your shoes, for your jewelry, for your bikinis, for your tan, for all of that stuff, for all your competition needs. Check that out. How many have I had?
Beautiful. That's it. Beautiful. No, that's it. That's what we needed. It's always interesting having this podcast, and people, when you ask them that question, they just all freak out. They're like, oh, I don't really scroll on Instagram. It's like, come on, man. You use Instagram.
Still scroll on Instagram. Do you know what I do scroll on? TikTok.
Yeah, I'm not getting into that. I don't have TikTok. I don't
download it.
I refuse.
I do like hashtag Indian TikTok, and I'm just scrolling it, fascinated.
I guess for those that don't know you, which I'm sure most of the listeners already would, where can people find you?
Okay, so my Instagram is at Joe_Physique Collective. If you want to see mostly like my client posts are on there. If you want to see my content, the majority of that is at Physique Collective. So you can either go to physiquecollective.com or in the App Store or Google Play, is that what it's called? Store?
Yes.
Play Store, whatever it is. Search Physique Collective. Now, it is a subscription site, so you will have to part with £6.99. I don't know what that is in Australia.
So I think it's about 14 bucks Australian. It's cheap.
It's very cheap. Listen to the man. Anyway, we got like over 1,000 hours of videos on there. We've got an exercise library. We've got loads of videos on drug use. Basically, we use the sort of moniker of physique development simplified. There's lots of us there. Cooking videos, posing instructions, a forum with many of my clients and others posting what they're doing drug stack wise, loads of progress logs. Like, it's the place to be, basically. If you want to listen to my podcast, go on joejeffreycoaching.com. It's the Optimal Physique Development podcast, or you can find that in iTunes by searching that as well.
Beautiful. Thank you, sir, for jumping on and having a chat. And I'm sure we will have you on soon. And as always, thank you to the listeners for tuning in.